Yeah, hope my audio is coming through all okay. Um, Hello, Oliver. Lovely to have you here, and
Well said.
welcome everyone to another neighborhood salon. For those who are here the first time, this is a format we're experimenting with within our Discord server, almost like a fishbowl style conversation where we have a particular topic, a bunch of people talking about it, and others could observe passively, or they could jump in, ask questions, offer their comments or feedback. And it also gets recorded and shared with the larger community. So we've been experimenting with the format, we've been experimenting with the time zones. If you have feedback, please feel free to share it in the chat rooms. Um, I just want to start by giving a brief intro to this conversation. Thanks to Moritz for setting these conversations up. Moritz reached out and mentioned Oliver, who's been thinking quite a bit about algorithms, and more recently algorithms in distributed Web3 architectures, and it sparked a conversation within neighborhoods, within some of our rooms around what algorithms for distributed environments could look like. Um, and I thought
hmm
it might be very like the next step could actually just be having hosting a salon like this where we explore some of these ideas together. So what you're seeing here is pretty raw. It's pretty exploratory, and that's the point of salons like this. So yeah, really grateful for those who've joined us here today in the salon, and for Oliver for sparing his time with us. And I thought to start, Oliver, do you want to share a little bit about just like maybe a couple lines about your background?
Sure,
And
sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. So I guess I've been interested in recommender systems and algorithms
Mm,
since the 2016 election, because that's where it was very obvious for a lot of people that something's
mm,
very off
mm,
with how recommendations work currently. So I started exploring that in various ways. I did a lot of little experiments in the recommender system space,
mm,
and thought about how you can do this in a better way. And some of these experiments led to Potential, which is an app that collects your intentions,
mm,
and you can kind of optimize your day for intentions, and then you can use that as a data source to do better recommendations. Because I do think there are two big problems that need to be solved um, in order to
mm,
uh, create better recommendations. And one is that data is currently siloed within a few platforms,
mm,
which why Web3 is kind of interesting because you're trying to break that. And the other
mm,
one is that you have a massive misaggregation of what kind of data is actually valuable to do
mm,
good recommendations.
mm,
So right now we capture a lot of kind of like impulses or clickbaits. You click these three videos on YouTube, therefore you probably like this one too.
mm,
But what you're actually capturing there is impulses. You're not actually capturing what
mm,
were the reasons for that user to click those in the first place, and what kind
mm,
of reasons led them to the platform. So
mm,
maybe you wanted to learn guitar, and then you saw this
mm.
funny cat video, and you clicked on that. So your true values are somehow getting lost um,
Yeah.
within your browsing habits.
Mm,
Um, but anyway, maybe, and that's kind of led me to where I am now, kind of researching how you can solve these problems and playing around with different experiments.
mm,
And I guess I came across Neighbourhoods thanks to Moritz,
mm,
and I really like the approach because I think it's totally the right way to go when it comes to try to split up the platforms from the data. So
mm,
that's a good basis to work from. And then I had some questions around like how would you actually go about doing any sort of machine learning based recommendations in a distributed environment? Because
mm,
Holochain in Holochain you don't have one single source of truth which you can
mm,
work from. You have a bunch of data split up
mm, mm,
amongst the users. So it's hard to kind of aggregate one data set from which you can train models.
mm.
And there are ways around that, but I guess that's how the conversation sparked. We
Yeah.
can maybe take it from there.
Nice. Yeah. Thanks for laying that ground. Do you want to share a bit about what drew you to Holochain? I know you touched on it, but that might be a nice landing ground for this conversation.
Yeah. So I guess I'm fairly new to the whole Web3 space, although I've been following projects like Mastodon and ActivityPub and later Twitter's Blue Sky for a while. So I do think the key issue here is to kind of split the platforms from the data. But obviously, Holochain is very much in that foray too, and I really like the kind of pragmatic approach of like, let's not get lost in all of these like token stuff. That's not the key issue here. We want to build great apps. So it's a very pragmatic approach that I really like. And then I guess Neighbourhoods. Well, I found Neighbourhoods thanks to Moritz, and it just makes a lot of sense, the whole approach.
Yeah, thank you. Like you raised I think you brought up a couple of interesting points. Web3 architectures, or at least architectures like Neighbourhoods, allow the splitting of sorts between I guess you could say splitting off the actual tech tools and the data that drives algorithms, and I think that's an interesting portal or an opportunity that's thrown up for us. Simultaneously, you're working in an environment where there is no single snapshot of the truth, and that just goes everything against what algorithm curation depends on, is that central snapshot. And so I think that to me outlines this landscape of more distributed architectures within Holochain and Neighbourhoods, and you could say even in Web3. And while some aspects are strengths, there's others which are actually weaknesses, because you don't have that snapshot, and someone who's trying to drive curation then has this question of, how do I do it without the snapshot or this dashboard? And all I'll say is, the more I think about it, the more I realize this landscape is actually different. It's actually, the shift is pretty deep down in the stack. And I don't mean just the technological stack. I think just in the way we've approached what curation is, how we aggregate, like who drives that engagement, whether that even needs to be driven in certain social situations, or what the factors for driving engagement are. And so I think that to me serves as a very interesting conversation and could be the landing point of what we discussed today.
Your thoughts. For sure. I guess that's how we had that before. We had the Web 1 where you had a bunch of very niche forums. Instead of every social interaction happened on either Twitter or Facebook, you had like a forum for people who were a lot into model airplanes, and people who shared your values. And in those forums, like when they're fairly small, you don't really need that much curation at all. You certainly don't need algorithmic curation. And I guess you made the point as well. Within, if you were within a group of your friends, it would be weird if you had some sort of like curation mechanism that like highlighted your post above my post when it's just a bunch of friends. I guess the bigger the context, the more you need some sort of curation mechanism. And that depends on kind of how big these neighborhoods ends up being. I think you mentioned that you could see some neighborhoods approaching hundreds of thousands of users and maybe the millions. And that's where, in those situations, I think just having no curation is not feasible. And already for me, like if you look at something like Discord, that's a social environment with no real curation. And I have like 20 plus channels, and each channel, or 20 plus servers, and each server has 20 plus channels. And if there's a message in each of those channels per day, on average, that's 40,000 words a day to parse through if you want to read everything. So there needs to be some sort of filter for what's relevant and what's not relevant. And that doesn't necessarily have to be, like classic top-down AI collaborative filtering model. As you mentioned, it could be some sort of some other mechanism, but there has to be some mechanism. And I think it's interesting to start to think more in terms of like social creation, which is how it works in the meat world, where like I have a bunch of friends and they recommend stuff to me. because they know me and they know my values and they know what's important to me.
Mm.
And kind of try to digitize that in some
Mm.
way, where I have certain people that I've built up reputation with, or
Mm.
that I trust,
Mm.
and I might trust you a lot on like distributed systems, and I might trust my my
Mm.
brother a lot when it comes to keeping his word because I've known him for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And if you have that some digitized some way, you could probably recommend content or filter content
Mm.
based on this kind of reputation graph in some
Mm.
way. And it
Mm.
doesn't have to be this, top-down approach. It
Mm.
could just be
Mm.
what other people are in this neighborhood that you
Mm.
already trust on certain topics or something like that.
Yeah. Thank you. What I can introduce now, and maybe this is the point of the salon, is to also talk about how neighborhoods approaches some of this and what features of neighborhoods could be leveraged for algorithmic curation. And so to start things off, I think there's two features about neighborhoods that are really relevant to today's conversation. I think number one, we think of neighborhoods as an organizing principle for the distributed web.
Mhm.
Traditionally, you had platforms which were, you know, the water coolers or where people gathered or met each other or engaged with them. But the Web3 or distributed architectures allow for a rejigging of that. And we think there will be several attempts, and maybe neighborhoods is one of those. And so we just want to push that curve, or, be one of the many attempts at figuring out what this new way in which we aggregate is. Um,
Mhm.
and so we actively use reputation data to define what forms a membrane and how people discover each other within that membrane.
Mhm.
And so you could crudely say it's a group's culture which defines what creates a neighborhood. Like what's different
Mhm.
from what's the difference between Oliver's neighborhood and Sid's neighborhood? They might be doing the same thing, like they might be sharing the same memes or playing chess or whatever, but what's different is the culture that they share, the sense of humor they might share, and the actual people
Mhm.
within it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the first aspect of neighborhood that stands that I think is worth exploring. And secondly, you again touched on this briefly. We don't have as many walled structures or silos in the distributed web. So you could actually see porting of information from one neighborhood to another pretty easily, which is
Mhm.
really hard to do in platform architectures. And I think there's something there that to me is, it feels like that is the secret sauce that we could actively leverage, because that to me means we don't actually need, neighborhoods to necessarily run into the millions before any kind of algorithmic curation makes sense.
Yeah.
But they could be, pretty small neighborhoods, but are borrowing intelligence from each other. And
Mhm.
so you almost have, as opposed to top-down centralized AI that's guiding, an app, you have a distributed web that's guiding an individual's interaction as they move from one neighborhood to another. And
Mhm.
that to me is interesting. And I think we will collectively discover what that is. It could be neighborhoods, it could be Web3. We'll find out.
Mhm.
But there are some interesting themes there that are worth picking up, because it almost to me models more real social situations. Like if I were to attend a dinner party hosted by Oliver, and let's
Mhm.
say there's 50 guests, it would be weird for you to be talking to me every minute, asking me if I'm feeling curated or if I'm feeling engaged.
Mhm.
Like that's weird. But instead, there's a certain template you set for that setting. Maybe there's a certain way in which we're sitting or introduced to each other, or the way the space is designed, and then we kind of bump into our own serendipitous encounters. But I might also meet someone I go to the gym with. I might also meet
Mhm.
someone I work with. And so we carry our previous contexts into this one. And I
Yeah.
think that to me, like that carrying over or porting data from one situation to another is
Mhm.
worth exploring and unbundling for distributed architectures. Um, so yeah, I would say these are two
Yeah,
aspects of neighborhoods that stand out.
for sure. Like I think the porting your reputation data or just your data in general is super
Mm,
important, and that's kind of what I thought was interesting about Blue Sky and
mm,
ActivityPub from the beginning, in that they're trying to not only have you port your built
mm,
up reputation and your likes and what have you, but also the entire messaging history,
mm,
so that you could just interact with someone using one platform while they're using another platform, in the same way that
mm,
you with email interact with someone while using Gmail and the other person is
mm,
using Apple Mail, but it's
mm,
still the same kind of messaging history. But
mm,
I think just like just likes and reputation and that kind of stuff. If you have that portable, including your
mm,
social graph too,
mm,
that goes a long way. Just that,
mm,
so that you don't have to every time you go to a new dinner party
mm,
start from scratch and build up
mm,
your reputation anew,
mm,
because that would take a long time and it would kind of create this
mm,
lock-in effect. Even if you can move between platforms, you'd still have this lock-in effect of like, oh, there's no point in going there because they have to start from scratch again.
mm.
Um,
Yeah.
in collaborative filtering, you have this cold start problem, as you talk about, which is, how do you do recommendations when there is no data to start
Mm,
with? Um,
mm,
and this would kind of, break through that, in the sense that you already have a basis for creation wherever you go,
mm, mm,
that you can port. So I'm 100% with you on that.
mm.
Um,
I hear you. Um, I have. I think. I guess it's a question for you. And
mhm,
stemming more from, mm, my time spent in Holochain and with neighborhoods. Um, what in your mind do you think this? Like, I think many neighborhoods will exist, not necessarily, like, won't have the same motivations as, say, apps or platforms. Like an Airbnb
mhm,
exists today because it's a for-profit entity, and it hopes to make a certain stream of revenue through engagements of its
mhm,
users. A neighborhood would have different objectives. Some neighborhoods might exist. Someone might create a neighborhood to generate monetary revenue from its members. In
mhm.
other cases, it might have purely social purposes, and by social, I mean like I might be part of a neighborhood just because I like my stream of memes to come from these 500 people that I think are hilarious. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and in those groups of 500 or 50,000 people sharing memes, there may not be like streamlined objectives of engagement and eyeball grabbing. And I wonder what you think as an algorithm designer. Is that motivation enough to drive an engagement, to drive a neighborhood, to drive engagement with the neighborhoods? Is it like, or do we need that monetary incentive to grab people and keep them engaged? And I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I'm not sure I follow the question exactly. Like, do you
So
need monetary incentives to keep people
yeah, like
uh,
I think about
engaged?
sometimes, like I might be part of a group of 50,000 meme sharers who just doing
Hmm.
it because it's hilarious.
Yeah, yeah,
um
yeah,
but the founders of this neighborhood may not be answerable to shareholders, may not be generating like massive sums of money from this.
yeah, yeah.
um and I wonder, in that case, will we be able to create algorithms that engage people? and
Right, right.
and
I
and
see
a
what you
and
mean.
a and a and a fork down the road is, well, what would there be a difference in the algorithms? Would that be an interesting difference? Is what I think about. um
Yeah, well, I guess you'd want to move away from this paradigm of the
mm,
attention economy that we're currently in, for sure.
mm,
Like, it's not good for anyone, and
mm,
it's not good for people, because big corporations have an incentive to change what you believe in order to sell your stuff.
mm, mm,
And you end up with kind of optimizing for outrage and all of these things, which
mm.
this kind of humane
Yeah,
take movement has laid out very
yeah.
well. But at the same
But
time,
it
I guess
it works, right? Like, it is that low hanging fruit which drives and oils the machine, and it works, and people feel engaged. And at the end of the day,
it works, and
as
they
much
do
as
feel
my
engaged in the moment.
yeah, yeah.
but not in the longer term. And that's kind of where this miscapture problem comes in, where you only capture impulses and engagement, but you don't
Yeah.
actually capture what is truly valuable for these people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I guess a good thing about something like Neighborhoods is that you have a lot more exploration surface for appeasing to different types of values. So you could have one neighborhood community which is all about funs and giggles, and that would be great. And it wouldn't be bundled up in the same context that you have your work friends who share things about Web3, or I don't know.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't be sorry. I'm just gonna
Yeah,
mute.
there's some
That's
sort
good.
of disturbance, I think, at your end, or maybe
Yeah,
it's me.
I think it was someone in the. I'm muting them. I hope that's okay. You can unmute yourself when you want to talk.
Oh, sorry
Um,
about that.
no worries. I guess with the current way platforms work, is you're kind of enforced to use a certain format to express yourself. And I guess it would be great if there was a lot of different types of cultures and ways of expressing yourself. So you don't have to kind of comply to this format, because it does end up driving a certain culture. And I think that's also interesting with Neighborhood, that you don't enforce everyone to follow a certain way of expressing yourself, and thereby a certain culture. Like yes, the tweet format itself, that you can only express yourself in 240 characters,
Yeah.
drives a certain culture. And the same thing goes is for Facebook. There are some limits in how you can do that, and I think that's super cool. But it might be a bit of a tangent.
I guess what I'm curious about is, as a generation, and I feel like I'm older than most people here. I don't think we've genuinely experienced algorithms that aren't out to monetize us, or our experience of the internet over the last decade
Well,
has been
I don't think that's quite true.
we've been engaged. Okay, let me frame it this way: we've been meaningfully engaged because TikTok has shown me a video that grabs my eye, sets a tune in my ear, and I'm thinking about it and like really gripped by it. Will Neighborhoods algorithms, or what like, I don't even want to frame it as, will Neighborhoods algorithms keep people engaged? I think it's more this question of, will people be able to orchestrate themselves enough and use like, what would an algorithm that's born in Neighborhoods, like, what would be different about it if it's
What will
not
be different about it?
moderated? Yeah, and so the question is, what is that difference? And
Right.
and maybe this, it might also be nice to open it up if people in who are watching want to add a comment or a question on this topic. Just unmute yourselves if you'd like to unblock your camera or switch on your camera. You'll also pop up on the screen. But yeah, just feel free to unmute and jump in and add a comment or question at this point of time.
All
And
right.
so I'm
I can
curious about that. Yeah. And so open to your
I can try
thoughts.
to get an answer to that. So I think first and foremost, I don't think it's easy to just kind of look at what's happening in the social space and end up with a conclusion that personalization is horrible. Like
Yeah.
these kind of personalizing or recommendation systems are horrible. They ended up with all of these externalities, and therefore we shouldn't have them at all. And I think that's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I do think like personalization is great, and a world with no personalization would be super flat and mediocre. And if you go to YouTube and just like go there in a private tab and check the explore section, it's just shit, because it doesn't know anything about you yet. And with that said, I don't think we should optimize for engagement as we currently are. And the reasons we're doing that is because of this monetization and data silo problem. And Neighborhoods wouldn't have that.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have this problem. And if a neighborhood is using one algorithm that just doesn't appease you in the long term, you can just hop out. Whereas with Twitter and Facebook, you're kind of locked in. Like if you want to engage in these conversations, you're locked into the platforms. You have to just swallow their algorithm.
Yeah.
Whereas that wouldn't be the problem in Neighborhoods as much. And I think there are and I think I'm excited for the possibility of having lots of different algorithms that people can play with and plug and play in in a neighborhood's
Yeah,
environment.
almost like these
Where in a
libraries or templates that people can then play with and plug, almost like applying
yeah,
skills.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it would be super cool if someone had like a meme page where there was some sort of algorithm that optimized for laughter, and then in another place there was some sort of algorithm that tried to highlight thoughtful discussions, and you can kind of choose which context you wanted to go into.
Mm, yeah.
Um, so I don't think you want to get away from personalization entirely.
Mm,
But I do think you want to experiment a lot more. I
mm,
do think you want to get away from this paradigm of
mm,
the goal of
mm,
algorithms being to
mm.
keep people hooked and their eyeballs glued to you.
Yeah. I sense a key difference might also be in holochain neighborhoods environments. Your role as a community activator or someone who's just created a neighborhood is to set up a template of sorts, and then
Mhm.
within that template people start bumping into each other and engage with each other on the basis of you know what that architecture is allowing. And so it's this
Yeah, yeah,
slightly different role. Like you aren't literally sitting there like trying to get the hamsters to spin the wheel, but instead you're architecting this cultural space and saying, in my space, this is the sense of humor that is amplified the most. Like maybe I like
yeah,
dark
yeah.
political humor.
Mhm.
um, I will architect my space in such a way that these sets of memes flow through the most, get amplified the most, and therefore that sense of humor is most apparent within my ecosystem. And if people do resonate with it, it kind of, you know, like a social organism expands as more people
Yeah,
resonate
yeah.
with it. And so it gives you these tools to modulate culture very specifically, almost surgically. And
Mhm.
so you could, literally expand from like 500 people to 50,000 or 500,000, but still maintain that sense of humor. Like your sense of humor doesn't need to become generic as you scale. And I use
Yeah,
this
yeah,
example of memes because it's just so like sense of humor is so specific, right? Like
yeah.
people can resonate with this idea of laughing at a joke with 500 other people who share that sense of humor with you. And so I think there's this shift of, oh, it's slightly more like passive, it's slightly more creative, and it's
Mhm.
also experimental. Like I'm going to have to experiment with a bunch of different ways. And so
Mhm.
I like what you said, almost like these plug and play algorithms that we'll have an option or a library to play with. So as a community activator, I might have the option of choosing between templates, like some curves which allow only the top 5% to be heard. Maybe I've created a distributed network that's talking about
Mhm.
climate change, and I don't want varied voices. Like I want only specific voices to be heard.
Yeah,
Or
or
I
you could
might,
have some sort of system that highlights
yeah.
people who have built up a lot of trust in that topic or something like
Yeah.
that.
Or I could
Whereas you don't.
say, I've started this discussion group on climate change, and I'm inviting people from 50 other communities that I respect. And so if you are highly rated in those 50 neighborhoods, you get heard instantly. But if you're not in the top 1% of those communities, you don't actually get heard. And so you could have very exclusive curves, you could have very inclusive curves. So maybe I just want a broad based ideation strategy. Maybe there's a pandemic like COVID that's broken out and we have no idea what it is. um, Hello, I think it's Casimir, I think you might want to mute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem. You're welcome to unmute if you want to add a comment or a question.
Okay, great.
No
Thanks.
problem. um yeah, so I think like if you want a more broader set of voices to flow in, you might want to plug in a curve that's more um inclusive, and so almost like a flat probability distribution curve, and people from all ends of the curve can join in and offer their voices.
Mhm.
You might have other kinds of architectures as well. You might want to, you almost have to decide what kind of affirmations you use. Do you use more positive only, like claps and likes, or do you also use the upvote and downvote Do you have more objective data like timestamps and frequency of posting, which defines how often you get, how much you get amplified? That could be critical for transactions or resource sharing, where it's more about consistency that's more important. And so, like you said, like just the surface area and what's available expands. And so I think then for people to be able to pick and choose, set up the room in a specific way, and then kind of step out and then watch it all happen. Like, to me, that's what neighborhoods algorithms would feel like, as opposed to I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm just running this platform because I need to monetize my users. Like I think that's the shift away from that culture. And so from our end, I will say there is very much an incentive to make starting a neighborhood and running it playful. Because if we introduce friction into the process of creating a neighborhood, and by friction I mean you either need to be a developer or have fundraising skills to be able to start a neighborhood, I don't think it will allow experimentation. So we will definitely be at that end of the spectrum where it's playful. You could start up a neighborhood in little to no time, with little to no development experience or fundraising experience. And we're talking about whether it needs to take a wizard format or more a dashboard format. But basically, through the marketplace, pick up a bunch of tools. Through the cultural library, pick up a bunch of templates and splice them together, and then off you go. And then it's constant iteration and tweaking to see if you've got the recipe right as you keep getting this neighborhood going. But I think playful is the key word, and which is why I think the early use cases might just be conversational, basic resource sharing. I guess we won't try and fly a jet plane with a neighborhood in the early days. Like, I think that.
No, I think that sounds great, and I think there's also some sort of like loop where if you start with playfulness and you create this very small like contained spaces where people are allowed to be creative and playful without a lot of risk, then you kind of encourage that culture of playfulness too. Because on Twitter and Facebook, where everything is public, there is a lot of risk with you kind of stepping a little bit outside of your boundary, which creates kind of this fear of being very expressive and being very playful. So on Facebook and Twitter, I see a lot, at least maybe more so on Facebook, you see people kind of taking a step back because they know that they might experience social backlash if they step a little bit outside of their turf. I guess the same thing on Twitter to some extent, and it's not great because you end up with this culture where everyone's very careful. No one really dares to say what they think, and if they do, they might get canceled. So 100% for like smaller, close-knit communities centered around playfulness, where you can play and express yourself in more various ways.
This freedom to fall in a way, right? Like your damage
exactly.
extends only to the membrane, or only in contextual ways. Like it's not removed from context and then pasted completely out of context. Or even if it flows outside of the neighborhood, it's only in related or allied spaces that would understand that sense of humor and where you went wrong, as opposed to plucking it out of context. And
it's a bit like, I remember in the early days of internet, when you had a bunch of really weird internet forums, and mostly just forums of nerds, like 4chan, which is a bunch of outcasts who were saying the most ridiculous things and just kind of out competing each other with being shocking because it was fun. And then Facebook kind of gradually grew on the side, which was this normie platform, and then there was at some point some clash where people like, what the fuck are you doing? And they had good reason to ask that, because it's this very weird culture, which then somehow bleeded into the mainstream and became what it was. But I don't think from the beginning, 4chan and these like weird internet forums was so much about like hatred and hate speech and these kind of things, but it was more just like playful avenues of expression, where people who felt like they couldn't express themselves in the real life properly found a way to do that. And as kind of Facebook swallowed this up, a lot of problems started emerging, and this kind of very fringe thing suddenly became real, and people realized that they can play with people, and with these algorithms that kind of drive behavior. You can drive people in various ways based on your needs. So the space kind of shifted, but I'm definitely for kind of having smaller contained forums with membranes, which I think is a very great word you say, where like you can enter freely, but there are some kind of rules that you have to uphold as you go to this new neighborhood. You have to and then the people within the neighborhood has to have this membrane which they can configure in a way so that only certain people are left through. I think that's something that you want, because I don't think the culture we have where everyone can say anything is great. It leads to cancel culture, and it leads to people being careful and not taking risks and not being able to say what they think.
I think what, to me, it's basically a room where everyone is yelling at each other, and so it leads to a culture where whoever yells the loudest gets heard, right? And so
exactly. So it's just like whoever can say them, like at least a Trump, basically, like someone who just yells very loudly and says the most obscene things. Is someone who drives a lot of engagement because people get angry and they share this. So,
well, I guess again, if people do have comments, just unmute yourselves and jump in. I guess empathizing with the others, why we ended up with these architectures was every time someone thought of a membrane or restricting the flow of information, there's this immediate thought of, wait, why would you not want scale? Why would you not want more users on your platform? Are you telling me you would restrict people from signing up for your app just because they haven't done this or don't believe, aren't funny in this way? And so I kind of see it because, 15 years ago or 20 years ago when I first got onto the internet, or 25 years ago, the dream was like stepping into this vast wonderland, like me as a kid sitting in India who had like access to very little things, could speak to anyone across the globe. And so there was this dreamy-eyedness to like, I can just check in with Oliver from around the world and chat with him about what his life is like. And I feel like that, I guess that pendulum swung too much in that way, and we're now starting to, rationalize and start integrating the internet in a more wholesome way in with our lives. And so I think membranes will make that comeback. I think the importance of context will make a comeback. But I think for 100%. It to make a comeback, we've got to think very carefully about the effects of tribalism and lack of scale, because we'd gravitated out of the membrane model because of those reasons. I grew up in 1990s India, where we had communal riots, and the dream of neoliberalism was so fresh because it helped us snap out of those communal tendencies. And so for me, what's really important is for I would love to see algorithms which compute or make computations on the basis of cross-membrane data. And which is why, again, at Neighbourhoods, Michael's developing RepLang, which is a native language. And this, like, a core competency of that language is to be able to compute data from across membranes, from across like varied sources. So if I think, the likes in Oliver's community are relevant to me here, when I'm making computations for my, cultural algos, I can actually go across 500 membranes or 50 membranes, and computationally it makes no difference. It's all the same. It's just data, but it's just sitting somewhere else and needs to be fetched before. But like the system needs to be prepared to be able to do it. And so I think we might see algorithms which become really smart at like linking across contexts, and which is why I think they'll be really close to ground. And so you might see interesting activities where, like, let's say I've thought of this really funny meme this morning and I posted in one community, um, but it gets validated in 50 others, that are related. Or, let's snap out of the meme example. I might do a couple hours of volunteering at my community garden, but that activity shows up in 50 different neighborhoods that I might be part of. So it might be, other neighborhoods that value this kind of work. Some kind of giving back to the soil work. It might bump me up in climate change conversation algos in 25 other neighborhoods. So I think,
Definitely, yeah.
and so I think, to me, that like is insanely more scale, because algorithms are leveraging informational economies. Like, information is fundamentally a non-zero sum resource, and so
Yeah.
shouldn't be trapped by monetary economies which are zero sum. And so I think the unleashing of this, there's a window there through which we could achieve some incredible scale. And so I think it balances some of the trade-offs that we made over the last 20 years, which is why we find ourselves today with this generic scream at one another internet. And so I think about that. I try and play devil's advocate about, like, well, it's, both Oliver and I agree that we should not have this kind of internet, but why have we landed here? And I think solving what the world needs, or why we got here in the first place, it feels critical to me. We
Yeah.
need to make a strategic case for these algos to land, as well as like an ideological one or a principled one.
Yeah. Great points. Lots of great points. I guess one point to riff on the last one first, around there being a lot of use cases for having membrane communities, but some way of tapping into data from other communities, and kind of tapping into some sort of trust graph that propagates through a lot of communities. I can see that there is one person who maybe is not even in the same neighborhood as me, who has a lot of trust built up in the context of climate change, for instance. And then someone else within my community trusts him a lot, and I trust him. So there is kind of this chain of trust that can be used to highlight different types of content. So you definitely want some sort of data shareability, but you don't necessarily want that data to be monetized, at least not within the platform. So there are some projects, just to kind of like open the space a bit on other approaches, who are working on this. Ocean Markets, for instance, is this like Web3 marketplace for data, where they also have like a data commons, but as well curated data sets.
Sorry, which name what name did you say?
Ocean Markets.
Yeah.
And for instance, just to kind of like give you an overview of like how it could look like, there's an app as well called Swash, which collects all of your browsing data as you go through the web, and then it sends it off to this data union, which in turn owns this data set on the Ocean Marketplace. And if anyone wants to use that data to train a model, they can do so, and actually train the model on the premise. So it doesn't have to leave the premise.
Yep.
So you can send the model through federated learning and train it where the data is, so privacy is preserved. So that's one approach, and then another approach, I guess, is built into Holochain. Like if you do this within the context of Holochain, all of the data lives within the network somehow. So as you mentioned, I'm not sure how the repline works exactly, but there is probably some way to.
And so I guess the difference there is with Ocean Protocol. I think I'm talking about the same project. Wouldn't that data be mapped onto almost like a universal data set, and whether that works for, like, I think that might work for, let's say, advertising, and these are the ads that Sid needs to see.
Yeah.
Would that work in more contextual curation? Maybe not, and maybe that's where, like, I think architectures like Holochain need to make an appearance, because they're all based in those membranes or like contextual landscapes, right? And so it starts leading to matches that are much more contextually like this joke was funny in this group. Like I don't want to know which joke was validated as funny by 5 million people. Like that's stupid to me. Like I don't share that sense
No,
of
yeah.
like it's almost like IMDb or Rotten Tomato ratings, right? Like today they're almost meaningless because you have one group of people that absolutely love the movie and another that hate it, and then you land up with this, a generic 6.5 rating, and it makes no sense to you.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, I don't. Yeah, yeah,
It depends on what kind of,
yeah.
I guess, what kind of applications you're doing, and yeah, I guess in certain cases, for instance, when it comes to trust, these kind of things are not that useful if you only get a small slice of it. You kind of have to have a lot of context for it to be useful. So the whole thing is cool in that way. But I guess the problem that we talked about also, maybe we can get into that technical limitations, is that the data is not stored in one place. So if you want to run a centralized model on it, you can't really do that. Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't want to do that. But in certain cases, I could see it being useful. And using kind of like the contextual trust data that you talked about, grouped with a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
And you could potentially do that by having some sort of aggregation mechanism that people can opt into to create a data set and then train that where on some sort of server that you have agreed on to port the data to. Or you could try to implement some sort of federated learning mechanism where you actually do training on the user's edge devices. And there are some research in that field which are becoming pretty interesting. So I know, like just as an example, like Google do a lot of that now with their Android phones, where the keyboard suggestions are all trained on your device, but then the results are sent back to a centralized model somewhere. So there are ways you could probably use the data within Holochain too, without having to like have it exit
Yeah. And I
the
wonder
premises.
if like some of that processing could then happen at a neighborhoods level, or it could happen, maybe some processing is also required just at an individual level, which yeah, though I can't think of what
I'm
that
not
would
sure,
be.
but I could see a future where there is a lot of just different methods and algorithms and things coexisting. Maybe some run on an individual level and some run neighborhoods level, and this kind of like plug and play like environment where when you set up a neighborhood, you can kind of choose what to put in there.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I think what we can do is close the formal salon for now, and we might stop the recording. So if you're watching this recording later, you won't see the after party, I guess. And so we'll I guess we could move more into an informal phase from here. Um,